Well, Melissa Whitecross is to be our first speaker this evening, and I'm sure many of you have come across Melissa, um, and she'll be speaking about one of her huge passions this evening. She works for BirdLife South Africa and is heavily involved in the conservation of terrestrial birds through BirdLife South Africa. She's a real champion, and it's wonderful to have you with us, Melissa. And yeah, you're on the receiving end of being on a webinar tonight. You're normally introducing the BirdLife conservation conversations. So it's really good to have you with us this evening. And yeah, you're going to be talking to us about BirdLife Secretarybird conservation work. And we really look forward to hearing what you have to say to us this evening. And yeah, I don't know if you managed to do a test with your screen sharing, but hopefully everything should work as usual. So, Melissa, without further ado, I'd like to hand straight over to you. And thanks again for being with us this evening and coming to share your story with us. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Rick, and thanks everyone for being here tonight, and Liz as well for the invite. It's wonderful to have a platform like this where I can come and talk about secretary birds. I never need an excuse to come and talk about these wonderful charismatic birds. So thanks so much for the invite. And as you said, Rick, it's not normally me who's in the filler of the webinars. I'm normally at the front and the tail. So it's nice to be the one on the stage again. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Just before I kick off, BirdLife Secretary Bird Project's been around since 2011, and it's been largely driven by Ernst Retief and Dr. Hunleen Smith-Robinson. I joined the project back in 2018. So what I'm going to be sharing with you is not just my work, but what they've also worked on over the years. And we have a whole range of funders who have supported us in this work. So their logos are all on the screen there. And we're very thankful to Patrick Byholm and Caroline Howes, who are also collaborating on the project. So to sort of set the scene initially, we know that Africa's raptors are in big trouble. And back in 2015, this red data book's getting a little bit out of date now. We had an assessment regionally here in South Africa and Lesotho and Swaziland, when it was still Swaziland, showing that of our 80 raptor species, over a quarter of these are considered regionally threatened. So that means that they are on their way to facing extinction if we don't do something about it as the conservation community and the broader public as well. And unfortunately, 6 of our species of raptors are critically endangered within South Africa. Luckily, the bird I'm going to be talking to you tonight does not fall into that category yet, and we are going to do everything we can to try and stop that from happening. But one of the biggest drivers of these declines in our large apex predator birds in Africa is habitat change. And this is largely through agriculture, human settlement, and just human expansion in general, changing the landscape and making it much more difficult for these wide-ranging predators to eke out a living. And I think the story is very well told by the charismatic secretary bird. As Rick has already said, I'm extremely biased when it comes to the supermodels of the raptor world. I mean, just look at those legs and that wonderful crest of feathers on its head. They've also done the cover of many a publication, from National Geographic's Year of the Bird launch all the way to the Roberts Field Guide. And they even sit atop our national emblem here in South Africa. So it really is a bird that's captured the hearts and minds of the African continent, and it is endemic to the African continent. It's found nowhere else on Earth except here in Africa. And it's very much a species of the open grasslands and savannas. These are birds that need nice open landscapes. You won't find them in woody or shrubby habitats. They're very much an open savanna and grassland type species. We do find them in the Renosterveld and Strandveld as well, but predominantly across Africa, you will get them in those open grasslands and savannas. And this is really prime habitat for them. So these are the Eastern Free State grasslands, where my colleague Ernst has done a lot of work, and that's prime secretary bird habitat that you're looking at there. Obviously being winter, it's a little bit brown, but trying to maintain these grasslands across Africa has been a real challenge. We as humans like minimal effort exercises, and it's very easy to move into a grassland and change it up versus a forest where we've got to cut down trees. So a quick Ecology 101, I'm sure most of you don't need this lesson, but just for those of you who don't know South Africa's biomes, that big green blob in the middle of South Africa is our grassland biome. So that's largely dominated by nice open grassland spaces, and that's one of our heartlands for secretary birds. Back in 2019, the secretary bird was the bird of the year for BirdLife South Africa. Every year we choose a different species to highlight. And what we did in 2019 was launch the BirdLife Bird of the Year Challenge. So we sent out the public to go and record as many secretary birds as they could. And they came back with over 800 sightings from just over 130 observers. And this has largely given us a nice snapshot of where we're still finding our secretary birds in South Africa. We know areas of the Northern Cape are not particularly well surveyed, so don't be too worried about that big gap you see out in the Northern Cape. But on the eastern side of the country, where we do have a lot of good coverage, we've got some really nice data looking at where these birds are still found. And if I just bring that grassland blob back quickly, you can see very much secretary birds making use of that grassland biome. It's a really, really important landscape for them. Now, in the recent National Biodiversity Assessment, which came out in 2018, we found that the rate of habitat loss, so this is how much habitat has been lost as a percentage per year between 1990 to 2014. The dark red areas are areas that have been rapidly transformed and really irrevocably transformed. If we go to the more pale red to pink areas, they're still relatively natural and intact. So we can see within that grayish grassland area, there's been a lot of transformation already, but there are still some islands that are pristine, and we're working very hard to keep them that way. It's unfortunately a very dangerous landscape for our secretary birds. There are numbers of threats that these birds face. You can see in the top left there when I was talking about human transformation of landscape, something as simple as the way we manage our landscape. So burning regimes, grazing regimes, these can all have an impact on how the vegetation structure of a system is dominated. And you can see there on the right-hand side that grassland area versus the overgrazed and probably often burnt area behind the settlement. This can have a massive impact for secretary birds. If those bushes get too dense, the birds are unable to move in and forage properly. So losing out on these open grassland areas is a massive problem for them. They're also susceptible to secondary poisoning. So with the use of rodenticides and pesticides on locusts in particular, which make up 86% of their diet, it can have huge knock-on effects when it comes to exposure to these harmful chemicals. Unfortunately, linear infrastructure is also a massive threat to these birds. Power lines and fence lines, you can see a bird caught up in that fence line, sadly, fatally, are a huge challenge for these birds. And just in 2019, one of the birds we were tracking, Kwezi, at just 6 months old, on its very first dispersal flight away from its nest, flew straight into that power line you can see in the top right there and was fatally injured. So it's very much a big threat, these linear infrastructures across the landscape, and we're looking into ways to try and mitigate that with partners like Eskom and our farmers. Now, sadly, it's quite a concerning story for our secretary birds. Back in 2014, Sally Hofmeyer did one of the first studies which really highlighted just how big trouble these birds are in. Between the two Southern African Bird Atlas projects, we've seen an over 70% decline across South Africa in our secretary bird reporting rates. In Swaziland, a similar story with about an 80% decline. And Becky Garbett went out in 2018 to replicate a Botswana raptor road count. And she observed an over 78% decline in reporting rates of, or encounters with secretary birds on that road count survey. And sadly, in the Sahel region, birds have pretty much gone extinct. That whole region through the Sahel, we're not finding secretary birds according to the latest surveys. So very, very concerning when we look across the entire range of these formerly considered quite common wide-ranging birds. And this has led to BirdLife International and the IUCN Red List Committee deciding that in 2020, our secretary birds qualified for endangered based on the population declines and the data that was submitted. So these birds are slowly slipping. You can see back in 2004, they were least concern, 2011 uplisted to vulnerable, and now in 2020 down to endangered. And we really do not want to see this slipping trend continue. So BirdLife South Africa has been working very hard, and we rely a lot on our citizen scientists to help us save our secretary birds. We've had a number of different causes, from reporting programs to nest location databases, as well as our Facebook group. And we've been interacting a lot with people about our secretary birds to try and raise awareness and also just find out where our birds still are so that we can prioritize our conservation efforts. Obviously, the Southern African Bird Atlas Project has been a major contributor to our understanding of where these birds still are. You can see some of the data there on the screen. Relatively widespread, but definitely more common in the grassland areas as well as those Western Cape Strandveld regions. BirdLife has also been a huge contributor in terms of us monitoring the data through the BirdLife South Africa Threatened Species course. And we've had, I think, over 500 data submissions in the recent past getting secretary bird records. And as I said, in just 2019, we had over 800 sightings. So those records are starting to come through, which is great. In terms of the breeding database, we've been collecting nest records from all across South Africa. Whenever people encounter a nest, they send us the GPS coordinates and, if possible, whether there are chicks or not. And we're slowly starting to build up quite a nice database of what's going on with our birds. In areas where we've had very dedicated observers, the likes of Dawie de Swart, as well as Eileen Stradom, who did a lot of work in the Wakkerstroom area, we've got really good nest density data. You can see those white and pink dots. And then the orange ones coming through ad hoc from various people. But one of the really big things that we've been able to do over the last decade is to monitor the movements of juvenile secretary birds. And my colleague Ernst set this up back in 2012. And we've been using GSM solar trackers to monitor exactly where these birds are going and what's happening to them after dispersal. I'm not going to go into all the details here because I could literally take an hour to tell you all of the things that we're learning about them. But one of the key points that I wanted to just raise tonight is that our protected area network is not sufficient for protecting these large, wide-ranging raptor species. And only 3.2% of the tracking points that we collected actually fell within some kind of formally protected area. So it's a big red flag for us, and it means that we have to work with private landowners to try and secure areas for these secretary birds, because they're not spending a lot of time in our actual nature reserves and game reserves and sort of private parks. So that's one of the big things that we've been working on through the biodiversity stewardship mechanism. And another way that we've been using this data is to try and understand the habitat suitability for these species. So using some of our BirdLife data as well as our tracking data, we've been collecting these point locations which give us a hit on a suitable area for the bird to be. We then clean up that data so that it's only data after 2000. And we do a process that's called data rarefication. So where we get a lot of points that are likely the same bird or the same pair in a territory, we just clean that up so that it doesn't bias the model. And we just put 1 point down, even if that bird's been seen multiple times. We then bring in a whole range of environmental variables, from climate to topography and land cover. And we can use all of these different environmental variables to infer what it is about the landscape that's important for secretary birds and allows them to survive in that landscape. And we do a process that's called habitat suitability modeling. So we combine all of this environmental data with our point data, and very, very clever computers will then spit out what's called a habitat suitability model. And in the one that I'm going to show you on the next slide, areas that are printed out in yellow are more suitable for the birds, and areas in blue are less suitable. So what we first do is clean up the environmental data. Not all environmental data is necessarily relevant, and we don't want to clutter our models. But once we've cleaned it all up, I have a colleague, Robin Cullen, who's been doing this for all of our threatened birds across South Africa. We get an output that looks like this. Now, no model is perfect, and we still have to improve these models as we go out and ground truth them. So we will go out to all of these areas highlighted in yellow and make sure that we are getting good secretary bird hit rates in these areas. And then likewise, we also go out into the blue areas and see if we are too thin on data. So one of the areas that we are particularly thin on is that Eastern Cape region over here. I'm not sure if my mouse is showing up on the screen, but that sort of Eastern Cape inland area, we know there are secretary birds there, but our data for that area is a little bit thin. So we definitely can improve on this model, but it's a good start. And BirdLife's done a lot of work in the Eastern Free State grasslands, just to the east of Lesotho, and that area has come up very, very hot and suitable for secretary birds. And two of the key things that we found with our secretary bird model was that it's really important for us to have large intact grasslands. So at least 1,000 hectares or more of intact natural vegetation comes up as good suitable areas for our secretary birds. And likewise, that model clinging very much to those open landscapes as we suspected. So secretary birds avoiding areas with dense woody cover. They like those open grasslands. So it's always good when your model infers back to the biology of the bird. Like I said, we've still got a lot of data to be put in. So the Kalahari, where we know we get lots of secretary birds, and that Eastern Cape region needs a bit more ground truthing, but we'll continue working on that and improving this model as we go. And as I said, the last thing that I really wanted to touch on was the problem of fence fatalities. BirdLife's actually got a fence collision reporting system. So if you do ever encounter a bird, not just a secretary bird, any bird, tangled up or caught on a fence, please do report it to us. You can just jump onto our website and you'll find the button there for fences and birds, and you can report that sighting with the GPS coordinates. And we've got a whole range of solutions in a brochure that's available on our website to look at trying to mitigate this impact, from flappers to increasing fence tension, and also just trying to reduce the hook rate of birds on that top strand with barbed wires. By simply replacing a plain wire on that top strand, you can have a massive reduction in the number of owls and other birds that are getting hooked on those small barbs. So there's lots of alternatives that need to be looked at. And Christian Brink, who's just started with us as the new raptor and large terrestrial bird manager, is going to be taking this project forward. And one of the big things he's going to be working on this year is a species action plan dedicated to secretary birds in South Africa. So if anyone out there listening is keen to be part of this workshop, Christian will be putting out feelers later in the year, and we'll be running a conservation workshop for our secretary birds and looking at ways to develop concrete conservation action plans for the species to take forward. So that's a very quick snapshot of BirdLife South Africa's Secretary Bird project. And Rick, I'm not sure if we want to do questions now or at the end of Les's talk, but I'm open to any if there are. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share this with all of you. And my contact details are on the screen if anyone wants any more information.
Thanks very much, Melissa. Wow, what a very comprehensive and professional presentation. Well done for that. I think it's always good to keep up with these kinds of projects, but and I try my best to do so on the information that's available and that's put out on the various media platforms. But to hear it directly from you just really brings it home. And I think yet again, just it's exceptional to hear what BirdLife is up to, and BirdLife and South Africa and the staff involved. A wonderful combination of good ecological, biological, and technological work being brought together into a melting pot to make sure that we get the best results out there and the best ideas as to what can be done to mitigate the concerns that we have for our bird species that are at risk. So thanks very much for that, Melissa. Perhaps what we can do, we do have quite a bit of time, is just go and check and see whether there are in fact any questions. Itasa, I don't know whether you've been having a look. We can just have a quick look and just whiz through the chat and see if there's anything in particular. Itasa, I don't know if you can just link in with me.
Yeah. I'm here. I'm not sure.
I haven't seen any questions yet, but maybe, you know, people haven't really had a chance to think about possible questions. Great use of geospatial data. I was alluding to that as well. Good work. Fantastic, Melissa from Ringham. Liesel van Deventer, fantastic research and work done. Thank you to all those involved in the efforts. Yeah, I don't think, yeah, I can't see any questions yet. So perhaps, folks, if you do think of any questions you have for Melissa, please do post them in the chat. And unless there are some, if there's anybody who'd like to offer any questions verbally, I'll just give you a short while. Steve, I see Steve Woodall raising a hand there. Steve, a question from you.
I was really impressed with the use of geospatial data, and as you know, I mean, we've used that in LEPSOC many times to do things like rediscovering populations of butterflies that were previously thought to be extinct. that's something that Mark Williams did several times using similar things where you look for places using he was using ArcView GIS, and you look for climatic and what do you call it when the landforms, slope and aspect and altitude and vegetational type, to try and figure out where you have the same conditions in other areas to places where the extinct species used to be found. And we had a lot of success with that. We obviously with things like Ericssoni Edgy. Be interesting to see. I'm just maybe a question for Les is this such a powerful technique for learning more about threatened species? Is there a move academically to create almost like a chair of research in this, to actually for use of? I mean, Les started the whole thing years ago with the ADU and with the original Sabat project, which has moved into all sorts of other areas. But it just seems such a powerful technique, but it just needs to be publicized more and get lots and lots of people into it, because it's a really good way of ensuring the future of a lot of our threatened and endangered species.
My sense is that it's actually been applied quite widely by many researchers in many groups in one way or another. So I think there isn't a sort of, I don't think a central sort of focus of it, but I think it's the methods are widely used. Melissa, I was part of Sally Hoffmeyer's research on Secretarybirds, and the thing that terrified me about that was that if you look at the first Bird Atlas book, whoever wrote the account for Secretarybirds, and I can't remember who it was, basically said Secretarybirds are having problems, but there's always the Kruger National Park, and the terrifying thing about Sally's work was the huge decline of Secretarybirds in the Kruger National Park, and one thing that you've touched on but haven't talked about a lot is bush encroachment, which seems to be a really, really serious problem for not just the Secretarybird, but for grassland birds in general.
Absolutely, Les. And I think if I was giving my longer version of this talk, I actually have a slide dedicated exactly to bush encroachment. And I believe one of your former students, Megan Lofty-Eaton, is quoted on that slide with her work that she did looking at bush encroachment in Kruger. And I think one of the scary stats that came out of Megan's paper was that anywhere that has more than 10% woody cover, we start seeing a dramatic decline in Secretarybird presence. So they really are hyper sensitive to the presence of woody species in their grasslands. And yeah, the Secretarybird Atlas data across Kruger is just devastating. I think back in the 80s, Alan Kemp had around 250 pairs present. I think we'd be lucky if we had maybe 40 birds left in Kruger at a push. We really need to get a handle on just how many are left in Kruger, but it's not a lot, and we're very concerned. And we think one of the big drivers of that is when these juvenile birds are dispersing out of Kruger, they unfortunately are being killed, and the species shows what's called natal philopatry, so a tendency to return back to the area where they were hatched as adults once they've done their sort of juvenile dispersal years and wandered off and explored the world like many a good teenager does. They like to return to the same area, and we think sadly when they exit Kruger, many of them are killed, and so the recruitment back into that Kruger population has been probably slowly declining over the last couple of decades, and we're seeing the real impact of that now.
Thanks for those comments, Les and Melissa. And I think that you've partly, Melissa, addressed a question or a comment from Mark Heremans, where he just says the large reserves like Kruger and Kalahari do not appear strongly in the habitat model. I think that the Kalahari could possibly be linked to the fact that the data still needs to come in for that area. But any further comments on those two large conservation areas?
Absolutely. So Kalahari is quite an interesting one. We see these massive congregations. I've literally heard a report of 38 secretary birds standing at a single waterhole in one temporal period. So we see these huge influxes of birds, and I think it's largely linked to good rainfall and locust outbreaks that we get these big influxes of them. But from a sort of all year round permanent point of view, the Kalahari gets quite arid and they're very reliant on water. So while the birds are around the water holes, the broader area is probably a little bit dry for them in winter. So it's not as suitable as somewhere like the Eastern Free State grasslands, which remain what we call online all year round and suitable for the birds. The birds in the Kalahari are a little bit more nomadic, which is why it probably didn't come through as brightly on the suitability model. Likewise with Kruger, the basalts up the east side of Kruger are sort of largely dominated by grasses, so more suitable, but the western side of Kruger, which is more granitic and woody, definitely isn't very conducive to secretary birds, and that also will interplay in the model outputs as well.
Great, thanks, Melissa. Mark, I hope that has addressed those comments of yours. Ringham has asked, and this is based on the observation, the clear observation that, Melissa, that you showed that secretary birds spend most of their time outside the protected areas. And you mentioned that this is a cause for concern. And Ringham has asked, can you share more light on how the project is engaging with private game reserves and what is their experience with conservation efforts? Any challenges relating specifically to private game reserves?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do work with private landowners, so largely cattle farmers, funny enough. We do a lot of work with private game ranches. We do work with private nature reserves too. So there's a mechanism in South Africa called Biodiversity Stewardship, which is a government recognized mechanism that allows private landowners to declare their properties for conservation, and they derive the conservation value of that sort of private nature reserve or protected environment. There's sort of various levels of conservation recognition that they can get for their property. And what they really do is sign up to manage those properties in a way that benefits biodiversity. So in the Eastern Free State, we've got the Snoeberg protected environment and the Upper Wilge protected environment, as well as the Ngula Nature Reserve, which are three sort of sites that we work on. So Ngula is linked to the Eskom Ngula pumped storage scheme, and we help them manage their nature reserve to protect all of the threatened grassland species, including the secretary bird and a number of other endemics. Just adjacent to that is the Upper Wilge protected environment, which is largely cattle farmers. And some of the major challenges that these farmers experience is just being able to balance biodiversity needs with their own. So making sure that the grasslands are healthy, they can stock their cattle and still derive that economic value without diminishing the environment for their birds. And obviously trying to keep aliens out is costly, managing aliens. So we do a lot of herbicide support where we get targeted teams to go in and help remove things like black wattle out of waterways and that sort of thing. So it is a challenge maintaining our grasslands, and these farmers have really done a phenomenal job of committing to conservation and keeping those grasslands healthy. And obviously trying to maintain good burning regimes, so not overburning or overgrazing those grasslands. It's a fine balance, but we work very closely with them to try and keep our birds happy and keep our farmers happy too.
Thanks for that, Melissa. I think that the work that's being done with the stewardship programs is a fantastic example of what is necessary and what can be done. Ringham, I hope that answers your query.
Yes. Thank you.
Great. If I just think of in recent years, the work that has been successfully done through the stewardship program has been responsible for protecting vast areas of previously unprotected important habitat, particularly in the upland grassland areas of our country here in South Africa. So really, I'm amazed at the work that's been done, and congratulations, Melissa, to the team that's been involved. I know that there are a number of NGOs that are involved in this, and it's wonderful to see what is possible in developing these programs to the benefit of not only our birds that need these areas, but all sorts of other biodiversity as well. There's just one further question before we go on to Les's presentation. Brian van der Walt asks about artificial nest platforms and providing these. Is that something that has been looked into or considered, and would it serve a purpose?
So the interesting thing about secretary birds is they typically make use of a nest for about 5 years, and the nest either gets too heavy for the tree, or the tree just can't really cope with the birds using it constantly. So what we find is after about 5 years, the birds will either move to a neighboring tree, or they'll move off to a new area. So I know of one nest where a nest was transferred onto an artificial platform because the tree had fallen over, and the birds did actually continue to use it for a while. It's not something that we've explored extensively, but it definitely could be something we could look at going forward. It's not something that I would say I'm an expert on, but I do know that birds have used alternative platforms before, so it could be something to consider, absolutely.
Thanks for that suggestion, Brian. Melissa, thanks once again for a fantastic presentation. I think that you've very succinctly put us very much in the picture with regard to this iconic bird of the grassland areas. So thanks so much, and we look forward to welcoming you back sometime in future to give us an update. So thanks so much for a wonderful presentation.